Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. We're continuing with the naval leaks that happened, and this one is for Germany. There's only one vehicle that was leaked, and it is the Deutschland. Now, the Deutschland is a German cruiser, obviously known by the Deutschland class. This is incredibly similar to a vehicle that we already have in the game, which is the Admiral Grafspee. Which is already around. People usually call these things pocket battleships, even though they are technically heavy cruisers, and it's just because their armament is a lot larger than your standard heavy cruiser. Where most heavy cruisers sit around the 203mm mark in gun, this one has 280mm guns, or specifically it has 283mm main cannons. The vehicle itself was also renamed in the middle of the Second World War to Lutzow, which is kind of interesting. So that is something to actually have a look at too, because you might miss some of its service record because of the fact that it was renamed. This vehicle actually kind of survived the war, not really though, but technically it did exist after the war. But it's another one of those which got absolutely pummeled by the RAF. And one of the interesting things about it, everybody knows about the Tirpitz, right? Where in November 1944 there was a huge raid by Lancaster bombers and just absolutely annihilated it. Well, the same thing happened to the Deutschland and also hit the Eugen too. The Deutschland, now at the time known as Lutzow, was in dock, and the Lancasters of the 617 Squadron were able to hit it. Now, if you don't know who 617 Squadron are, those guys are the Dam Busters. So basically, this thing has an even closer tie to history in its death. The vehicle got hit by a bunch of 1,000-pound bombs, and eventually it sank. The actual crew itself put charges in the hull to be able to try and sink it. They detonated prematurely and ended up killing a lot of people. It was then refloated though, so it was able to go around, but unfortunately, yeah, at that point it was pretty much worthless, so it was used as target practice, and that's pretty much it. But this vehicle took a very active role in the Second World War, being involved in a lot of the European theatre for the Germans, and I would say is much more successful than a lot of the other vehicles that were around. This thing had 6 283mm cannons in 2 sets of triple turrets, very similar to the Grafspee in the game. It had 8 15cm single turrets, or 150mm, and then also 3 88mm single turrets too. Didn't really have a ton of AA on it, at least when it first came around, but this vehicle was very much a kind of early 1930s vehicle, which is really interesting to think about because it's very much known for the Second World War, but it was around, 5 to 10 years before it. Another thing that I like to kind of look at when it comes to these machines is the armor, because the armor itself is, it's a little bit lower than quite a lot of heavy cruisers. More similar to the British heavy cruisers, which definitely favoured, larger guns and lower armour. But for me, this is closer to a battlecruiser idea for cruisers. The idea of the battlecruiser was that it would be faster, it would be more mobile than your standard battleship, but it would have the same punching power. So the idea was you could outmaneuver the enemy and use the guns very effectively. This didn't exactly work very well in the First World War and other subsequent areas, but in general, that was the idea. And for the Deutschland and also the Lutzow, that was kind of the idea too. Pack a very heavy punch with the main guns, and then you should be fine after that. And it pretty much worked with this one, being able to support a lot of different landing forces in the offensive and also in the defensive in the Second World War. It really wouldn't be a surprise if we see this thing too, since of course it is a vehicle which we already have in the game. This would just be a different version of it. There is another Deutschland though, which it could also be, and this was a training cruiser which was built in the 60s for the West German country. This vehicle is kind of interesting in history because it was one of those that bent a lot of rules. Basically, after the Second World War, there was a lot of restrictions that were put on Germany in terms of building stuff, because obviously they didn't want to cause any tensions again. So there was a tonnage limit on ships that were allowed to be built. This Deutschland ship exceeded them, but it was allowed, which was kind of surprising, showing maybe a shifting of the tides in the 1960s. This vehicle was built and it served for around about 30 years, and there was only really one of them made. This vehicle was primarily used for training, but the idea was if a war did break out, it could also be used as a hospital ship and even a mine layer or an escort. And this vehicle did have a decent armament for being a training ship. But first of all, its propulsion's really interesting. It had a combined diesel and diesel propulsion system, which basically means that you have two diesel engines which power through a single propeller shaft. So technically, instead of having two separate propeller shafts for two separate engines, everything gets fed into one, which I think is kind of interesting. So this actually used two Mercedes-Benz engines and then two Maybach diesel engines, which I think is really cool. And these fed, of course, into the good old transmissions, which then fed into the propellers. And overall, it's just kind of interesting. The speed of it was 22 knots, or 41 kilometers an hour, and in terms of radars and things like that, it had a bunch of different systems, because, once again, it was made for training. The armament, though, is probably the most interesting. It had 4 100mm single-mounted guns. It also had 6 40mm guns, which were the L70 Bofors, it seems, which of course are quite powerful. Then also it had some torpedo tubes and also anti-submarine torpedo tubes attached to it too, plus some mortars as well for the 375mm anti-submarine setup. So this vehicle, in terms of armament, would actually be pretty nice to see, and overall does have a pretty big place in history as something that did break barriers and got, I suppose, Germany back to normalcy that we see today. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem, Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.